Good morning, church. You know, if you're a visitor or guest, we do especially welcome you to our service today, and we hope that you'll take the opportunity to fill out that connection card and put it in the basket on your way out there today. It's just a way that we're able to acknowledge your visit with us here today. Every time we come together, we really have kind of one goal in mind, is that we really want to learn and grow and become more like Christ so that we can live a life that is pleasing to God. So each time we gather together, that's really what our purpose is all about. And last week, I'd asked you to pray about me. I went to my 40th class reunion last night, and I was just so wonderfully blessed and surprised in that to hear so many great success stories. And, you know, first and foremost, I think that I was really blessed and grateful to be able to go to a school like Perry, and that the teaching when I was there was exceptional teaching. As I look back on it now, I see them in a completely different light than I did when I was certainly there. But we were really fortunate to have such a good school with so many teachers and that who cared. And there were actually some teachers there last night, and I was really excited because one didn't remember me, and that was pretty good. But as I listened to some of the stories that many of them were sharing, and that, you know, and the great success that many of them have come to, and that in their lives, and just asking some of the right questions, I guess, you know, just finding out, you know, where they had and where they went and where they're going and things like that. And I began to hear story after story after story about how God has blessed their lives in such a way, and this is what they were doing with what God had given to them. One person was an inventor, a creator, and he created an interesting product. He now has a line of products. He was on Shark Tank, and his idea was picked up by Mark Cuban and years ago, and he actually uses the proceeds the way he told me, and that was that God has blessed him in such a way, not that he's able to go just on mission trips, but he is able to sponsor mission trips to Indonesia, to China, to Burma, to lots of parts of Cambodia in Southeast Asia, and that. And it just blessed my socks off to hear that as God was pouring into them, they were just giving back to God. I heard of another couple that have just started and launched a new ministry in Massillon, and I'm really excited about that. And so I was very encouraged because, you know, sometimes when people do well, you just kind of wonder where all that's going to go. And me, always looking for a good sermon illustration, I'm always listening, and I try to ask lots of questions. So, you know, it makes me stop and think about the idea that when your net value is kind of worthless, you know, where are you? So today's message is a bit of a referendum on how we manage our money, and can we manage our money wisely? Last night I heard so many amazing examples of how people were doing just that. David Livingston once said, he says, "I place no value on anything I have or may possess except in relation to the kingdom of God. If anything will advance the interests of the kingdom, it shall be given away or kept only as if by giving or keeping it I shall most promote the glory of him to whom I owe all of my hope in time and in eternity." That's a wonderful sentiment to have. And in our study here in the book of James today, he begins to turn his attention to wealth, to money, and these types of issues. Now, I realize that there's a lot of people that say they avoid church because of, well, the church is always teaching and preaching about money and this and that and the other. Hey, friends, get over it and get over yourselves. It's a part of life, and it is a part of the life of a Christian to have to deal with stewardship. And we just really have to go forward with that. And I'm so grateful that James takes the time to help us to learn how to manage our finances in a wise manner. I know that many people think that the Bible teaches about wealthy people as being selfish and greedy and so forth, but you know, that's really not true at all. That's not even close to true. Some of the greatest saints in the Bible were very wealthy people. Father Abraham, was a millionaire by today's standards. Job would have probably been the Bill Gates of his era. You think about David and Solomon. They were amongst the wealthiest men of their day. And many people have the wrong idea and say that money is the root of all evil, but that's not really what the scripture says at all. Listen very carefully what it says. It says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. See, God is not opposed to our wealth, and he's not opposed to us having money. But he wants us to use that wealth, whether we have a little bit of it, a decent amount of it, or a lot of it. He wants us to use it wisely and not foolishly. As Claudia mentioned in her prayer, compared to people in the rest of the world, every American is extremely wealthy. I knew a friend that one time he preached in La Paz, Bolivia, and it was a church of over 500 people in attendance, and at the last service, they wanted to take a big group picture. But they had to hire someone from outside the church to come and take the picture with just a cheap, inexpensive camera, because no one in that church, all 500 members, not a one of them could afford a camera. If you owned a camera, if you own an automobile, if you make more than $400 a month, you are very wealthy compared to the rest of the world, because that is the world standard. Isn't that amazing? So if we're going to handle our money with biblical wisdom, and God certainly has blessed America. You watch the Dow Jones, and people, of course, we're watching that because our elections are very much based on that, aren't they? We want to vote for the guy who's going to swell up our wallet. We don't want to vote for the guy that's going to shrink us down. That's something we all are watching and are careful. And I'm not suggesting that that's an altogether wrong thing. I'm just saying that we must manage our money in a wise manner. And James is going to give us 4 things that we have to do in order to be wise in the way that we manage finances. And they may not be as difficult as you think. So hold your toes. You should be okay today, all right? Here's the first thing that James tries to tell us in the first 3 verses when he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you." And he says that with an exclamation point, so there's a lot of passion that's going into that statement. He said, "Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days." And so what he's really saying in essence is this. The first key in managing our finances wisely is don't be selfish. He wants those who have gathered riches, and he has come together with these people, and he's really attacking people that have done it in an ungodly manner. And he's saying, go now, you rich men, and howl for the misery that has come upon you. Why? He's going to really emphasize the fact that they have been selfish. And he's condemning wealthy people who have gotten rich by the exploitation of other people. These rich people are not presently in miseries because they're living today, per se, in luxury. But there is an eternal misery that is coming for them. Just as it did to the rich man in Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus. This is described really well in the book of Luke in chapter 16. It says here that in verse 23, "And being in the torments of Hades, the rich man," he says, "lifted up his eyes, and he saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom." And James warns against such an individual. He says, your riches are corrupted. That refers to the grain that the wealthy landowners, these landowners, they would take this grain and they would rather let it rot in a storage container while there were people that were close by that were starving. I can remember working in the food industry, and we had waste buckets and things of that nature, and sandwiches and things that were made by mistake had to be thrown in the garbage. And I just used to really bother me because my mom was one of those, there are starving people in China people. And, you see this food just going to waste, but we weren't allowed to give it to them. And I think it's a shame that there's that kind of a mentality amongst some wealthy people that they'd rather see it rot than give it to some people who could really use it. The phrase he says, your garments are moth-eaten, refers to hoarding, perhaps even their clothing, and letting that clothing become moth-eaten rather than to give those excesses to the poor. You know, it's good for us every now and then to go through our closets, isn't it? I take really good care of my clothes. I've got certain clothes, I call them paint clothes and work clothes, and you'll know when I'm wearing them because they're a mess. They're always a mess. They look a mess because that's what they're for. But every now and then, I like to go through my closet and take a really good look and think, gee whiz, have I worn this in the last 6 months? Do I think I'll wear it in the next 6 months? And if not, let's give it to someone who can and who will. Why hoard it up? Why store it all up? I don't know. Maybe it's because I just like new clothes. I love shopping and buying clothes and things of that nature. But every now and then I just have to look and go, golly, Neds, there's got to be some folks out there that could use some good clothing. Sometimes we hoard unused stuff. And by the time we get to doing anything with it or about it, it's ruined or destroyed. Sometimes even when we don't need the money, we sell the stuff instead of just giving it to somebody. You know, it doesn't always have to be about making some money. I got a real beef with the new donation store, the Goodwill store. I've got a real beef with it. Have any of you been in it yet? I was in it. They wanted $12 for a shirt. I can go to Walmart and get a shirt for $12. If we're going to help people, then let's help people, right? I understand there's money and causes and things, and I get all of those types of things. But sometimes we just need to take a good look at what we got and say, I can't use all this. Let's give it to someone who can. To someone who can. Then he goes on in his warning. In verse 3, he says, your gold and your silver are cankered. Gold and silver cankering, that's a sense of corrosion, suggests that vast amounts of money going untouched for long periods of time because it's just not needed by the owner. Even though it's unneeded wealth, it's not being used to help the needy. Again, it's just sitting there. James writes in verse 3 here, he says, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as if it was fire. You have heaped treasure together for the last days. So the word heap here is talking about stockpiling money and doing it out of pure selfishness in the face of need. And he's not saying that we shouldn't save. He's not saying that we shouldn't invest. We absolutely should. In fact, the Bible teaches us that we should. In Proverbs chapter 6, in verses 6 and also in verse 8, it talks about considering our ways and being wise. He said that the wise man provides supplies in the summer and gathers food in the harvest. So we should always be saving and investing for the future. But there is certainly a difference between saving for the future and hoarding. Hoarding of all of our money in the face of need. You know, I don't mean to keep tooting my dad's horn, but I just have to, because the more I see, the more I realize what a great man that my father was. And it's seen by looking back at things like his old checkbooks and different writings and stuff. My dad had enough money to give to a lot of different things. It just seems like there were so many causes that he gave to. And I don't know that it really affected him all that much. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the more that my father blessed others, the more that God blessed my father. He understood that there were so many different groups and organizations and food pantries and things of that nature that he could help with those monies. And I'm not suggesting that everybody that's sitting on the corner holding a sign, will work for food, that you got to pour a truckload of money into them. And in fact, I'm really cautious and careful about that. As someone, the great man I've learned, said, you might just be greasing the skids to hell. And we need to be careful about that, of how we give our money. But we should carefully, and we should with prayer, and we should with some sense of calculation consider the needs of others in the midst of our great stockpile per se that God has given us. To make matters worse, you know, think about this. And maybe this helps us out a little bit. The number one contributor to divorce in the United States, what do you think it is? Money. Money. Just so you know, number two is children. Children, leading cause of divorce. They're both tragic. The United States is a nation of debt. Debt. United States is known as a people who go into debt, purchasing depreciating item after depreciating item after depreciating item, and they're generally things we don't always need. But at some point in time, sometimes they reveal a little bit of greed that we have. And you watch American television and you watch the commercials and stuff that are on there, and it's all about greed. It's all about the idea that you don't have a big enough one, you don't have enough of them. Let's try another one. Let's try a different one. The average American, according to Consumer Report, has less than $1,000 in savings. That's the least of any people in the industrialized world. To make matters, as I say, even worse, according to Consumer Reports, the average household in America owes more than $10,000 just in credit cards. And the sad thing is that Christians are no different than non-Christians when it comes to savings and debt. That's why every one of us needs to carefully consider a principle that's found in Proverbs 21, that there is a desirable treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man squanders it. I wish I could stand here and tell you I've never been a squanderer, but I have been a squanderer. And if we are fools to spend all that we make, what are we if we spend more than we make? What does that make us? Why do we save so little and spend so more than we make? I don't know. It could be because we live so much for today and we don't allow the biblical principles in our money management. I remember listening to Larry Burkett from Crown Financial Ministries when we first became Christians in that. And now Dave Ramsey's kind of the BMOC about some things like that. But that's important for us. Referring to possessions and wealth, James says this in verse 3, the rust of them shall be a witness against you. That means that God's judgment is going to be based on our checkbooks and credit card bills, friends. Checkbooks and purchasing habits, they reveal a lot about our priorities. I actually remember Bob Meyer one time, and you guys have all had a chance to meet Bob. He actually told me to take my checkbook once, and he told me to take 3 highlighter pens. And he said, take the first one, highlight yellow all of your needs. This is things like your reasonable mortgage. And he used to say, so much is kind of a reasonable, and anything above that you may have bought more than you should have. But reasonable mortgage, reasonable car, and that, if you bought a Chevy or this and that. And he used to tell me things like, if you're buying the big, whatever, living in your means per se, and then your household expenses, food, clothing, all that kind of stuff goes in a lot of that goes into your yellow highlighter, your needs. Then he said you highlight your greeds. He said use green for that. Green is all the money that you spend on things you don't really need or the excess on the things that you do. And you begin to look at those different things. And then he said, then take a pink highlighter, and he said, and highlight all of the seeds. That's all the finances and the monies that you use for the good of the kingdom. And then sit down on a monthly basis and take a real good look at how you really spend your money. And it was pretty eye-opening. And I would think it would be eye-opening for any one of us to take a look and say, man, maybe there's some things that we can do less of and some things we need to do more of. But that's for you to do your own evaluation. But we should do some evaluating because God certainly is and will. And we should take a good look at the idea, because Jesus warns us about storing up earthly treasures and possessions and spending things on ourselves. And today, knowing that we are making more than we make and going into debt, certainly we can't be too honorable to the Word of God. Jesus tells us in Matthew 6, lay up for yourself treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where the thieves do not break in and steal. And that's what really made me think about last night when I was talking to one of my friends, classmates, and he's just telling me about how God was providing for him so that he could lead ministry and missions all over the world. That was just amazing to me to hear that story. The Bible teaches us we can't take our treasures with us when we die, but what we can do is send them ahead. And we do that by using our resources the way that the Scriptures teach us to. The first step for us in not hoarding our money or spending it all on ourselves is just to really understand the scriptural idea of giving to the Lord. And you have to purpose in your own heart what you want to give. You know, the tithe and the way they break those things down. Actually, an Old Testament tithe really amounted to actually a lot more than 10%. I believe it amounted to about 27% of their income. And we're certainly not going that route. Each person must decide in their own heart and mind. And perhaps the best way to do that is to look at your checkbook and really evaluate what you could be doing more or less of, and perhaps what God might be asking you to do. We sponsor 12 missionaries and 5 mission projects. Maybe you want to get involved on that level and help out with that work that's getting done around the world. We need to think about the way that we give our money, knows that that money can help bring other people closer to Christ or to Christ in the first place. So we need to make sure that we're not being selfish with our money. Secondly, don't be dishonest. And there's a lot of ways that we can be dishonest. In the New Testament times, people worked for rich people, and they worked for them during the day, and they were paid at the end of each day. And the poor often lived on the verge of starvation. So if they didn't receive each day's wages, the whole family would go hungry. And they didn't have contracts, they didn't have unions, they didn't have minimum wage, and they didn't have labor laws out there to protect them. And that's what James is referring to when he writes and says, behold, the hire of laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, now cries out. The Bible teaches us very clearly that the worker is worthy of the wage. And I want to suggest that this goes two ways, friends. And one of my friends last night was talking, and I thought it was very interesting that when we both went in the fast food, and I managed for Wendy's, he managed for McDonald's. And that today I'm in the ministry, and today he's not an employee at McDonald's. He owns 22 McDonald's restaurants. And I found that absolutely amazing that he did that. And when I was talking to him a little bit, he talked to me about how important it is for him to take care of his workers. Every one of his workers in his 22 stores, he provides a special shoe for each one of them that they don't have to buy so that they can be safe in the store. He provides clothing items for them. He provides 401k for these employees. Health benefits, dental benefits, things of that nature. Jody and I were managers and didn't have things like that. And I just thought to myself, he understands the idea that the worker is worthy of the wage. That means that if an individual is working and they're doing the job that they're being asked to do, you owe it to them to pay them a rightful wage. You owe it to them to give them what is worthy and deserving of what they are doing. And on the flip side of that, if you are working for someone and you are receiving a wage and benefits and things of that nature, you are responsible to give them a good day's work for the dollar that they're paying you. That means that you don't clock in 5 minutes late and 5 minutes and clock out 5 minutes early. It means you get there early and you start on time and you work on time and you don't take unnecessary breaks, making phone calls, calling this person, going outside for a cigarette or this or that or the other. You're giving your boss an honest day's work for what he's paying you. It goes both ways. But James was more concerned about the fact that these people weren't being taken care of. He says, you shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren or one of the aliens who is in your land within your gates. We need to pay on time a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, whether it's a fellow Christian or a stranger living in the country. It doesn't matter who it is. I can remember learning about thousands of Vietnamese coming to this country after the Vietnam War and how many of them were exploited for cheap labor and taken advantage of. I think that might be happening today with some of the immigrants that are coming in. That could be happening as well. Now, our government seems to be taking pretty good care of most of them, and that's for another discussion, but we should not be exploiting these people simply because they're immigrants. James writing says, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath. The money made by exploiting human beings cries out to the Lord, just like the blood of Abel does. Only option of the poor is just to cry out to the Lord, which he says they do here, the Lord Almighty, crying out to him. His name emphasizes his power and his majesty, his ability to be able to intercede. Wow. Psalms 140 says, I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. Somber warning to any person or business that treats people unfairly or exploits other people. In my own heart, I have to believe that every Christian business person has an obligation before God to see that everyone under their supervision and authority is treated fairly and is paid equitably. It means you do the job, you should get paid for that. To me, that's fair. Everybody okay? We ready for the next point? Okay. So if we're going to manage our money wisely, don't be selfish. Don't be dishonest. And here's third. Don't be self-indulgent. Don't be self-indulgent. One of the greatest temptations, of course, is in living in America, where in relationship to most of the rest of the world, the American enjoys actually pretty good wealth. We really do. Sometimes we just want to spend it all on ourselves, don't we? In America, the problem isn't always hoarding our money, it's blowing it all on ourselves. Or as Jane puts it, living in pleasure on the earth and being wanton. That's a word that's usually written to the rich and landowners who are exploiting the poor people. But that applies to us today. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't live comfortably. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't enjoy the earnings. If you've worked your way up and you've built up a great business and you've done well for yourself, God bless you. Enjoy it. You've earned it. But just remember, God is the one that empowered you in it. God is the one that gave that to you. But you should enjoy that, and you shouldn't ever feel guilty about acquiring and achieving wealth. Never feel guilty about that. But don't be self-indulgent with it. Ecclesiastes 5 says, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. What that simply means is when you work hard and you work honestly, God certainly recognizes that and blesses you. Some people are really good with money. Now, my money talks, and the only word my money says is goodbye. It always has been. My brother was a better saver. I was the better spender. And so I'm grateful that I've got a good helpmate to come alongside of me to help kind of reel me in a little bit, because I might just give it all away. But what's it going to do me at the end of my days anyway? Right? God wants us to buy things. He wants us to have things that we enjoy. You know, I had a really nice motorcycle, and I really liked my motorcycle. Oh, it was a shiny red motorcycle, and I rode all over the place. I didn't buy the top of the line, and I didn't buy the worst bike I could find either. I got something in the middle there. And I didn't feel guilty about it. And the reason that I didn't feel guilty about it is because I knew that I'd been given to God what I believe that he had commanded me to give to him. I wasn't holding back from another ministry or something of that so that I could have something for myself. And that's kind of a difference between being self-indulgent. Well, I could give it to this cause, but I want to buy this, that, or the other. And that's kind of where we cross the line. And to those people who get rich by exploiting others, James writes and says, you have nourished your heart as in the day of a slaughter. That's pretty rough terminology. That's a sarcastic illustration at best, comparing selfish, dishonest, and self-indulgent people to the animals nourished for the slaughter, right? Like animals being fattened, people who are dishonest and hoarding and self-indulgent, they really only seem to be concerned about the present. They don't think beyond themselves. When tempted to behave like that, we need to consider the question of Jesus in Mark chapter 8 when he said, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul? We have to make provision for that. So in managing our money wisely, let's not be selfish, let's not be dishonest, let's not be self-indulgent, and here's the final thing, let's not be manipulative. We should not use our money to gain influence or position at the expense of others. James puts it like this. He said, you have condemned and killed the just, and he doth not resist you. In their selfishness and in their greed, the wealthy used their money to influence the courts to punish just people who just didn't have the power to defend themselves. And we see that happening again today. It's very difficult, our judicial system today, for people. It's hard because those who tend to have a lot seem to get away with a lot. And I don't want to pull any names, but you just think about who's been on the news and things of that nature. And because of their wealth and because of their influence, they're able to avoid the kinds of things that you and I would have to suffer and pay for. And we should suffer and pay for them, especially if we're guilty. But guilty people are guilty people. Some folks today fall into the same similar practice when they tolerate unfair business dealings, take advantage of people who might not have any means of recourse. And you think about people like tobacco people and things of that nature where, they try to drag things out. Somebody is sick and they're suing the tobacco company. They try to drag it all out until that person dies and then there's no one left to sue them. That's just dishonest. How about firing people who are close to retirement? That's manipulating. Someone's close to retirement, you kind of shove them out the door. I remember when Sir what's his name came over from Britain and wanted to take over the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. And he wanted to help himself to the big pension fund. And that would have left those people with nothing. That's manipulative. How about paying women less than men for doing the same job? That's manipulative. Promoting men over women or over other men who may even be more qualified because there's some affluence there. This is not a referendum on women's lib. Ladies, don't get on your soapbox. Yeah, rah, rah, preacher. Feminism's a bad thing, so let me just say that. Let's just say this. Feminism hasn't helped you. It's hurt you more than it's helped you. But fair is fair. We've all lived in communities. I've lived in some small towns where the good old boy culture is alive and well. I don't know if they have any of that here in Stark County, but I would imagine on some level they got it somewhere, right? God tells us in Psalms 82, he said, defend the poor and the fatherless and do justice to the afflicted and the needy. Still today, the poor and the elderly, the uneducated, they're taking advantage in our money-mad world. They absolutely are. And one of the saddest things we see that exploits people is the rapid growth of gambling and the legalization of it. And everybody talks about how good it is and all the tax money and all this, that, and the other. Jody and I have lived out in Wyoming, and we've seen what casinos do to reservations and those Native Americans who they're supposed to be helping with that money. We see chemical addiction and rapid alcoholism. You see prostitution at the highest levels, the total moral decay that comes along with that. But no, this is good for us. It's another example of calling that which is evil good, and we shouldn't do that. That's nothing more than our government taking advantage of people who just really aren't good at math. That's the way I see it. And as Christians, we shouldn't exploit the less fortunate, and we should do all that we can to prevent other people from doing that. We should never forget the truth of Proverbs 16 that says, better is a little with righteousness than the vast revenues with no justice. Well, that's a lot today, friends. And I'm really grateful for the people that you are. I've had the opportunity to visit with most of you, and I love the lives of integrity that you model, not only in your own home, in your business communities, and to other people's. And I'm just as proud as I could be of you. But we all need to be a little cautious. We all need to make sure that we're managing our money wisely and not being selfish or dishonest or self-indulgent, and certainly not manipulative. And we've seen that happen far too much. You know, when you go to a doctor for your annual checkup, they often begin by poking and prodding and pressing various places on your body, all by saying, does that hurt? Does that hurt? Does that hurt? How about this? Does that hurt? And if you cry out in pain, usually one of two things kinds of happens, right? Either the doctors push too hard without the right kind of sensitivity, or more than likely there's something wrong and the doctor says, well, we better do something about this. We better do some tests because it's not supposed to hurt there like that. Well, I guess I say that to say this. Sometimes when we as pastors preach on the financial responsibility, and sometimes members, we could kind of cry out in discomfort and maybe even criticize the message or perhaps even the messenger. Either the pastors push too hard, which I'm sure that I've done that, or maybe there's something wrong. And in that case, I just want to say, my friend, we're in need of the great physician, because for us, it's not supposed to hurt there. Let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Our God and our Father, as we prepare ourselves for the elements today, we take a moment just to really take a look at ourselves, perhaps in the financial realm. Are we in alignment with our profession of faith in you? Are we in alignment with what your word teaches about it? I mean, we are a blessed people, and you have poured out so much treasure from heaven that the world can't even contain it. And we're so grateful for what you've given to us. Are we being faithful? Help us, Father, to use the standard of your word. That's what will determine whether we need to repent and confess here today and submit to you. I do hope that, Father, as we examine ourselves and our lives and the blessings that you've given to us, help us to see those that are around us, especially in our church family, those that might be suffering, those that might really be struggling. Help us, Father, to be empathetic over their need, and show us how to be compassionate as well. At the same time, we want to be wise and responsible to them. As we ministering to others, we minister in the same way that we ourselves have been blessed in the past. And I hope that, Father, in doing so, that brings praise and honor and glory to you. For we ask this in Jesus' mighty name, and all of his people said, amen.